Hi, I'm Lisa Williamson, and we're going to be looking at the equine nutrition series. We're on PowerPoint number 5, which is Feedstuffs, and this has been created for BC Lower Mainland Pony Club education series. We'll be looking at cereal grains. Cereal grains are high in starch. That means they're high in energy. Grains are the most commonly fed high energy source for horses. Grains contain 50 to 60% more digestible energy per pound than hay. The most commonly fed cereal grains are oats, corn, and barley. There are other grains that can be fed to horses, although much less commonly, and those include rye, sorghum, triticale, spelt. Wheat can be fed to horses, but it is not recommended to be fed to horses for a variety of reasons. We're going to discuss that later, but some people do feed wheat to horses. The nutrient composition of grains is important. The digestible energy of cereal grains is relatively stable, so we're looking at 12 to 16 megajoules per kilogram. So again, if you're thinking about calories, think about the last slide. 1 megajoule is 239 calories. Protein levels in grains that we typically feed our horses are fairly moderate, which is approximately 10%. But in grains, this can often be a low quality protein. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Grains are often low in lysine. Grains can also be low in calcium and high in phosphorus, and grains are low in fiber. So all of these things can disrupt your horse's digestive process, and so we cannot exclusively feed grains. We need to feed grains in conjunction with fiber or bulk foods such as hay and or grass. They will provide the other nutrients that are needed. The cereal grains again are corn, oats, and barley that are most typically fed to horses. And looking at grain structure, it'll be the inside part of the grain where the horse is going to be accessing most of its nutrition. The outer part of the grain is where the horse accesses the fiber, which is an important part of nutrition as well. It helps to keep things moving through their system. Okay, we'll talk about oats now. Oats are the most commonly fed cereal grain for horses. They're considered a safe grain as they are less energy dense, and this is because there are higher levels of fiber in oats, so it's 11% crude fiber. Fiber is the outer part, or the hull, and this makes horses consuming them less susceptible to problems such as laminitis and colic. So the amount of oats that's digested entirely in the small intestine is relatively high. So absorption of protein takes place in the small intestine. So horses will get a lot of protein from oats, relatively speaking. Processing oats, that means crushing or crimping or rolling or something like that rather than feeding whole oats, will improve or increase the digestibility of the oat. Crimping or rolling can improve digestible energy content by 5 to 7% for horses with sound mouth. So if your horse has a good mouth, good teeth, good dentition, you can make the food more accessible to it by 5 to 7%. Processed oats last longer than other grains that are processed, and whole oats ultimately have a longer shelf life than processed oats. So if you leave the oats intact without crushing them, then they do have a longer shelf life than those that have been crushed or cracked or rolled or crimped, whatever you're going to do with your oats. But by doing those things, you actually make the food more accessible to the horse, the energy more accessible to the horse. Oats are highly palatable. Horses like to eat oats. Oats are low in phosphorus. They also disrupt the calcium-phosphorus ratio by having too much phosphorus in relation to calcium. Oats have virtually no carotene and are a poor source of vitamin B. If a dietary change is made from an energy-dense food to oats, more oats will be required. The energy content of oats is about 40% of its dry matter. Dry matter is referred to as DM in literature typically. Protein is usually in the range of 10 to 12%. The average is about 10%, which is approximately what the average horse needs for a protein requirement. Protein requirement of a horse is about 10%. The fat content is 5%, and oats contain 70% total digestible nutrients, or TDN. You'll see that abbreviated as in the nutrients. Okay, comparing oats to barley. Looking at barley now, they look similar, but barley tends to be shorter grain and a little bit fatter looking grain. Barley can be fed in a grain form or as a brewer's byproduct. So we've got two ways that we can feed barley. The processing of barley, that's again rolling or crimping or crushing or whatever, will increase its digestibility because it is a hard grain to chew whole. So it's harder for a horse to eat whole barley than it is to eat whole oats comparatively. So we can feed barley crushed or ground, but if you feed ground barley, it needs to be mixed with another grain to prevent colic. It can be steamrolled You can also feed it again as a dried brewer's grain, so something like brewer's yeast or dried distiller's grain. Brewer's byproduct, and by brewer we mean the process of creating alcohol basically, and it's a byproduct of that, the leftover thing from creating alcohol. Brewer's byproducts provide additional digestible energy, protein, minerals, and vitamins. So they're an excellent source of B vitamins, in particular thiamine. They contain 27% protein, which is way too much for a horse, but you wouldn't be feeding this as a main grain. When you're feeding a brewer's byproduct, you're feeding it in a supplementary form only. So in other words, as a supplement. You wouldn't feed this as the entire diet. It's also 7% in fat and then 16% in fibers. Barley has a low percentage of hull that makes it classified as a heavy feed. So it's not going to be as good as oats comparatively. Remember, oats had 11% fiber content. So fiber content of barley is 5 to 6%. So it's not going to be as good in helping to move through the system, so that will increase chances of colic. Barley also has too much phosphorus in relation to calcium. There's a 55% dry matter of starch, 9 to 12% protein. Again, it varies depending upon the source, but 9 is average, and so typically oats will be 10 to 12, 10 being the average. Barley can be 9 to 12, but 9 will be the average. So the amount of protein that your horse will be accessing in barley will be less than it will be accessing in oats. And again, it will be accessing a little bit less than the horse typically needs, which is about 10% protein. Digestible energy and protein of barley falls between that of oats and corn. So oats typically is the highest, then barley, then corn in amount of protein that's available. Okay, so looking at corn now. In the UK, or in the literature that comes from the UK, you will see something called maize. So maize is just the term for corn that is used in the UK. In North America, we tend to refer to it as corn. And corn is a New World or North American crop. It was brought over from North America to Britain, so it hasn't been fed as long in Britain as it has in North America to horses. There's many ways that you can feed corn to horses. Some people will feed ear corn, whole shell corn, cracked, crush, but you should never feed finely ground corn. It is too dusty. Feeding whole ears of corn will increase saliva, and that in turn will increase digestibility, but it also increases the chances of choke, particularly for those horses that bolt to their food or horses with dentition problems. Any horse with dental problems will not do well on ear corn or whole corn. Corn tends to be very, very hard. The digestibility of corn will be improved the more it's processed by cracking, grinding, or steam processing. Basically, steam processing will produce the greater glycemic response. Corn is high in keratin, which is a precursor of vitamin A. Corn has too much phosphorus in relation to calcium. There's 70% dry matter starch. Corn has the most energy of all the grains, and the amount of starch from corn digested in the small intestine is much lower, though, than oats. Corn has approximately 7 to 10% protein, and again, the average is 8. So if we're looking at amounts of protein, oats typically highest, then barley, then corn. There's also a low quality protein that you will be getting from corn. It's deficient in lysine and other essential amino acids. And then corn is also very low in fiber. Remember that oats was about 11% fiber, barley was 5 to 6% fiber, corn is only 2% fiber, again increasing the risk of colics, in particular impaction colics. Other grains that are sometimes fed to horses, wheat. We'll look at wheat. Not a good idea to feed wheat to horses. For one thing, it's very expensive. It's not economical to feed wheat to horses, but if you consider what do we do with the inner part of wheat? We grind it. It turns into flour. If you add water to flour, what do you get? Basically something like Play-Doh. If your horse chews the inner part of wheat, mixes it with saliva, then that same thing can happen in its intestinal tract, which raises the risk considerably of the horse developing an impaction colic. Because of that, you should never feed wheat ground, as this can cause colic due to high levels of gluten that will create a doughy mass in the stomach and along through the intestinal tract. So wheat is a heavy food, but why do we talk about wheat? Well, the important thing about wheat is that bran is the outer husk of wheat, and bran is commonly fed to horses. So bran is a byproduct of wheat. Wheat contains 80% digestible energy, only about 2% crude fiber, 11% protein. Other things that we can feed are rye. Most rye that is fed to horses are milk byproduct. If it's not available to you, then you're probably not going to have access to it. Rye middlings are the most commonly fed form of rye. If you live in an area where they're going to be processing rye, then you might have access to it. Otherwise, it will not typically be fed to horses. So what are middlings? Middlings are the fine particles of the kernel that are left after the whole grain is milled. There's a crude fiber content of 5%. There's a 72% total digestible nutrients, 17% protein, and then about 3% fat. Milo is a variety of sorghum grain, similar to corn. 8 to 16% protein, 2% crude fiber, which is low again, compared to oats at 11% and barley at 5 to 6%. 3% fat, 75% carbohydrate, so this is quite high, and a total digestible nutrients of 79%. Very poor source of vitamins and minerals and has even less carotene than corn. Spelt or triticale are other grains that can be fed to horses. Spelt is a relative of wheat. It's got a large fibrous hull. It has 9% crude fiber, so that's compared to all the other ones, only second to oats, so fairly high. 2% fat and 12% protein, so again on the upper scale of what we would typically want to feed our horse for protein. Again, 10 being considered sort of ideal. Triticale is a hybrid of wheat and rye. It has qualities of wheat and hardiness of rye, and it has 4% crude fiber, so again low. 1% fat, very low, and then 15% protein, high, too high. There's also prepared feed, so things that don't grow on a stalk out in a field, but are rather things that have been made in a factory or in a feed mill. There are the balanced or complete feeds, such as pellets and extruded feeds. There's also the byproduct. So we have talked about some of the grain product already, mentioned them briefly. So things like bran and rice bran. There's also fibrous byproduct like beet pulp, and then there's oil byproducts like linseed meal and soybean meal. Pellets. There's actually 4 different types of pellets that you can feed your horse. So there is something called a single ingredient pellet, so something like alfalfa meal. Then there are mixed grain pellets. Feed supplements, so vitamin mineral supplements, can be fed in a pelleted form, commonly are. And then complete feed pellets, so that's grain and hay together. So when you're feeding a complete feed, there is hay and grain fed together. When complete feeds were developed in the late 1960s, the idea was that it would be astronaut food for horses. They'd eat that one little pellet and that's all they would need. What they know now is that it is not going to work for the horse's system. The horse's system needs a long fiber source to keep that peristalsis working, to keep the muscular contractions in the intestine, to keep things moving through and prevent colic. If you try and feed only pellets and no hays, no grasses, your horse will quite likely get colic, and I don't know that anyone does that nowadays, but at one time it was thought that complete pellets could be fed exclusively to horses in exclusion of all other things, but that was soon proved to be wrong. However, complete feed pellets are very good, especially for horses that don't need the higher energy things or cannot cope with the higher energy things. Like typically you're not going to feed a pony a grain, but if they need a little bit of extra food, complete feeds are typically what a pony or a horse with a high energy level will take and utilize quite well. One thing about pellets is they're designed to be a balanced food. So theoretically, they're going to supply adequate fiber, carbohydrates, fats, proteins, vitamins, minerals. The minerals in the feed mill will be balanced and adjusted to the soil conditions in the area. And then you can also buy pellets that are adjusted to meet the requirements of different types of horses. So if you've got a horse that is at rest, if you've got a horse that is in moderate work, if you've got a horse that is in high intensity work, you can buy pellets for that kind of horse quite often. A more recent development in feeding are extruded feeds, and so they've been around for 20 or so years now, but extruded feeds are grains that are ground and then they have had pressure and steam applied to them and come out in a kibble, or they almost look like dog food type form. The process of steaming and applying pressure actually helps to preserve protein and vitamin content in the grain, or in the feed rather. Extruded feeds have a higher digestibility due to the composition. So the horse will actually be able to access more of what you are giving it. One advantage of this is it actually helps to make horses eat more slowly as well. Extruded feeds can come in a variety of different formulas to meet individual needs of each horse. They can be produced to meet the needs of horses that are prone to colic or prone to choke, horses that bolt their feeds, horses that are old and are not doing well, horses with poor teeth, horses that are growing, horses that are lactating, horses in very heavy work, on and on and on the list goes. So we'll look at bran now. So bran is a byproduct of milling wheat. So it's the outer husk of wheat. It is the outer husk of wheat in a flake form. The bran is high in organic phosphorus, so 1.13%, but very low in calcium. And this can cause the calcium-phosphorus ratio to invert. You can have big problems with calcium-phosphorus ratio if you feed too much bran. Bran also has 16% protein, so remembering back with feeding horses, we're typically looking at trying to feed them about 10% protein. So on paper, this looks high. It looks like a very high protein food, but bran is very low quality protein. This means that there is not a very broad range of amino acids in it. On paper, 16% looks good, but really the range of amino acids is very narrow. It is a low quality protein. You would not feed bran as a protein source. Bran has a surface area that encourages water adhesion, and so it's a good way to introduce medication or extra water into the diet. Typically, obviously, you're going to feed bran wet. That is the most common way to feed bran. It's highly palatable, although some people feel bran is somewhat abrasive to the intestinal tract due to the high fiber content. So bran at the moment is very controversial. Some people will feed bran to sick or tired horses, believing that it will actually make the intestinal system work better. It's easy to digest. If you feed it with warm water, it will introduce warmth into the horse's system, so they're not having to work so hard if they're sick in particular. But again, there are a lot of other people out there who have a feeling that bran is actually detrimental to a horse's well-being. It is controversial at the moment. I'll leave that one up to you. What bran does contain is about 67% total digestible nutrient, 4% fat, and then 11 or 10% crude fiber. So up there with oats, which was 11% crude fiber. Beet pulp, another controversial food. Tend to be two camps with beet pulp. People either love it or they hate it, like bran. So beet pulp, what it is the residue remaining after processing sugar beet. Typically, it's fed soaked to prevent colic, and it's also a dust-free food. Depending upon if you are feeding it in the pelleted form, definitely you must soak it because it will increase in volume so much. There are flake forms of beet pulp that you can buy in some areas, and my understanding is that if you are feeding the flake form, then look at the directions. The flake form has been fed, not soaked. Again, look at the directions, talk to the people at the feed store, follow the directions for feeding beet pulp religiously. If you do not soak beet pulp that is intended to be soaked, especially the pelleted form, you can cause severe colic in your horse because it will expand in the horse's system. Just do an experiment yourself. Put a little bit of beet pulp in the bottom of a bucket, add water to it, come back 8 hours later and see how much it's expanded. You don't want that happening in your horse's system. There was a recent study at University of Liverpool which found that there was a high correlation between large colon torsions, as a type of colic, and the ingestion of beet pulp. However, generally speaking, beet pulp, because it is fed wet, has been found in other studies to be good for horses that have colic because of the high moisture content and the high fiber content. Here's one study that says beet pulp is not good, and that was a fairly recent study, but typically most of the literature you will find will say that beet pulp is good in that it is a high fiber content, high moisture content, and therefore will help, if it's fed properly, will help to reduce the cases of colic. One thing to be careful about with beet pulp, if you're feeding it in the summertime, when it's hot, it can go rancid fairly quickly. You have to be on top of that. You can, if you wet beet pulp with warm water, cause the pellets to break down more quickly, and that will reduce the chance of being rancid. So beet pulp is very high in fiber, 18%. It's considered a super fiber, which again improves the ability to digest other fibers in the diet. So that was from a different study, not from this University of Liverpool study. There's a moderate level of protein, 9%, so that is, again, just under what our horse typically needs, around the range of barley, just under oats, but it is high in lysine, so that means that it is a high quality protein, so that is important. It's high in calcium, and the calcium phosphorus ratio is good, so it's fairly balanced. High in digestible energy, 30 kilojoules, so when you feed it though and you dilute it with water, you're going to dilute the energy. It's very digestible, 85%, again, because we break it down so much when we add water to it. It's low in starch and sugars, so if you've got a horse that has a problem with laminitis, this could be a good feed. Just make sure that you're not adding molasses to it. It helps with hydration. So if your horse has a problem and it's not been drinking enough, or it just tends to not want to drink, or you take your horse to a place and it doesn't want to drink the strange water, feeding something with water in it will help with hydration because you are going to be feeding it soaked. One thing about beet pulp, though, is low in B vitamins. There's no carotene in it and no vitamin D. So if your horse is on hay and grass and beet pulp, you probably will have to feed vitamin mineral supplement. There are other concentrates that we can feed to horses, rice bran being one of them. Rice bran has a high oil content and it's got a higher fiber content, and it can be high in protein as well. Peas and beans, we don't typically feed peas and beans to horses in North America here, but they are more commonly fed to horses in the UK. They're legumes, they have a high protein content, but the phosphorus is too high in relation to calcium. There are other additives that you can feed. They would be fed in smaller amounts. You would not feed these as a full ration. Typically, they're going to be higher in protein or fats. So things like oils. Oils are an excellent source of energy as they can contain 2.25 times more energy than carbohydrates and proteins. Oil supplementation should never exceed 10% of the concentrate ratio. Again, if you feed too much oil, it can coat the fiber, which will end up in the large intestine, and then the horse will not be able to access the fiber in the large intestine and break it down, and that can cause problems. Corn oil is the most palatable. 1 cup of corn oil is equal to 1.2 pounds of corn. Remember, oil has a protein-sparing action, so it just means that you can feed less grain if you are supplementing with oil. Fish oils can provide the most benefit to body condition. Other oils that can be fed to horses are soybean oil, canola, and then there's a variety of blends. Other things that we can feed to horses are linseed and flax. So flax is a seed, and you must boil it to remove the prussic acid. And then linseed is the meal extract that comes out of the actual seed. And both have approximately 25% protein and are very high in oil. Again, you wouldn't feed these exclusively in the diet. Feed them as a supplement. That's much too much protein for a horse to have. Supplement to build and repair muscle tissue, and then to provide oil to the horses because it's very good for the horse's coat if you're feeding that. There are some high protein concentrates, oilseed meal being one of them. So oilseed meal is a byproduct of all the different industries that we have that are out there. They are fed as protein supplements and should not be fed as a full meal. They contain 32 to 50% protein. Again, that is too high for the horse, but you're not feeding large amounts of them. Not all of them have a good range of amino acids, and they are low in fibers. Oilseed meals will come from soybean, cottonseed, linseed, sunflower, rapeseed or canola, peanuts, coconut, safflower. All of these industries will produce this meal as a byproduct, and these can be fed to horses. And again, it depends what's available in your particular area, whether you're going to feed these or not. There are vitamins and mineral supplements that you can feed to your horse. So vitamin and mineral supplements can either contain many nutrients, or they can be comprised of a single nutrient or a small selection of nutrients. Could be broad range, could be just a few, could be only one. Vitamins and mineral supplements are prepared ingredients that are designed to address nutritional deficiencies or help maintain good health or improve specific problems such as tying up, nervousness, weak hooves, etc. Other supplements, in addition to oils, vitamins, and minerals that can be fed to horses are things like milk replacers, amino acids, live yeast cultures, electrolytes, which we talked a little bit about when we talked about minerals, protein supplements, and enzymes. So all of those things can be fed to horses. So there is just a recap of fiber content of some different feeds. Now we're going to look at forages. So forages constitute the largest part of the horse's diet. So ideally 100% of the diet, or anywhere from 70 to 100% of the diet, should be forages. But forages or bulk food should never drop below 50% of the horse's diet. We're talking about grains or concentrates in relation to forages, which is hays and grasses. The chemical composition of forages: energy can be 15 to 30%, fiber 20 to 40%, water-soluble carbohydrates anywhere from 3 to 40%, and then lipids or fats, which is 3%. There's different types of forages. So we have grass that obviously grows out in the field, a seed and grass hays, which are preserved grasses, so grasses that have been cut and then are stored, what we typically call hay, and then the legumes. So we'll talk about those a little bit more. So factors affecting nutrient composition. The nutrient composition in forages is highly variable. So you can have very low quality, you can have very high quality. The factors that affect this are time of year that the grasses were cut or that the grasses are actually growing in the field, the species of grasses that are available, the soil type that the grasses are growing from, how the land is managed, whether it has been drained, whether it has been fertilized, whether the grass has been cut, whether the grass has been overgrained, presence of weeds, so many things. Environmental conditions, how much rain, how much heat, all of those things. The stage of maturity when the hay is cut. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then the process of curing and storing hay, very, very important when looking at the ultimate end product of the quality of hay that you end up with in your barn. So looking at just grass, which grows in your field that your horse can be eating. Grass is high in fiber. It's also high in moisture. If there's a lot of grass available in the field, this can help to decrease the rate of digestive disturbances. Or if your horse has access to grass, it can decrease the rate of digestive disturbances. Quite often, horses that end up in a situation where they colic, they go into the vet for possible surgery. One of the things that the vet often will say is go out, give your horse some grass, try and get it to eat grass, because the vets know lots of moisture, lots of fiber. Let's see if we can get things moving in there. And then, once the colic passes, hopefully it will pass, then continued access to grass will help this. Horses that are on grass typically will have a lower rate of digestive disturbances, specifically colic, than horses that are in stable or in paddock situations with no access to grass. Biggest problem with grass is fluctuating sugar levels. This can fluctuate on an hourly basis, and so therefore the risk of laminitis is much higher for horses on grass than horses in a stabled or paddock environment. Types of grass: there are things called seed hays. There are many different varieties of seed hays. Quite often when we're talking about local hay, local just means what is cut locally. For the average person in the average area, what is cut locally are seed hays. For pony club testing, we're not going to talk about the term local, because local just means what is in that area, because not all things locally are seed hays. But if you are in the Fraser Valley area where we are, typically what we will be having locally are seed hays. The most common seed hay is fescue. There are 320 different varieties of fescue out there. It is a very, very common type of grass that will grow tall and turn into hay, and therefore end up being cut in a field. Timothy is another type of seed hay. There's also rye, orchard grass, Kentucky bluegrass. The list goes on. There are many different types of seed hays. Here's another list right here: brome grass, etc. So looking at Timothy, Timothy is considered a very safe hay. It's commonly fed in the BC Lower Mainland area. It often is not grown exclusively here. You don't commonly see whole fields of Timothy, but when you look at a bale of hay that will be produced in the BC Lower Mainland, Fraser Valley area, you will often see Timothy stalks mixed in there with the other grasses. You can buy, typically from the interior or from Washington area, if you're living here in the BC Lower Mainland, straight Timothy or Timothy that is mixed with alfalfa. Here in the BC Lower Mainland area, we don't typically see straight Timothy fields, but you will often have Timothy mixed in with your other seed hays like fescue. One study showed that the protein content of boot stage Timothy was 13%, while the mature stage was only 5%. So basically, the earlier it's cut, that's boot stage, the higher the protein level. But if you wait for it to be quite mature, then the protein level is fairly low. And again, we're looking at ideally about 10% for feeding horses. The digestibility of protein in the mature stage was only half that of the boot stage. Timothy is easy to seed and establish. It produces well in early spring, and it can grow in a wide range of soil and climate types. It's a good crop to have out in a field. Timothy, you can recognize it quite easily by the stalks where the seeds are. Okay, so a little bit more about that boot stage that we talked about. Boot stage is when the seed head starts to emerge from its sheath, so in the early stages. Boot stage is when the protein and energy levels are highest. As a plant matures, energy and protein levels drop as something called lignin levels rise. So the taller the stalk of grass or hay, the more lignin is in it. And lignin is the thing that allows that stalk to grow tall. So there's little danger of colic or laminitis from overfeeding hay. If there are concerns about the sugar level of hay, you can reduce the sugar level by soaking it. But if you soak hay to reduce the sugar level, do not let the horse drink that water, because what's happening is the sugar is coming out of the hay going into the water. You need to go and dump that water somewhere where the horse will not have access to it. It's like drinking Kool-Aid or pop or something. Rye is another type of hay, and you can recognize rye because it sort of has the where the seeds are. There's that sort of left, right look to it. And you have to be careful if you've got rye in the field, if you have rye growing in your field, because there is higher incidence of laminitis if you're feeding rye. Okay, legumes are something that can be fed to horses, and legumes are plants with nitrogen-producing nodules in their root systems. Nitrogen is the nutrient that is most commonly leached from soil, and that will be one of the biggest determinant of whether you've got a high-quality soil or a low-quality soil. So what causes nitrogen to be leached from soil is rain. And here in the BC Lower Mainland area, we have lots of rain. We're living in a rainforest. The more it rains, the more the nitrogen is being washed out of the soil. So therefore, the lower the quality of soil is that your hays and your grasses will be growing from. But you can put nitrogen back into the soil by fertilizing the soil or by having legumes growing in the soil. A legume will be a plant like alfalfa or clover, etc. Because what they do is they actually, on the root system, have little nodules that deposit nitrogen into the soil. That makes the soil richer, and so therefore you've got a plant growing out of rich soil. Any legume will produce more nutrients per acre than a seed hay. A seed hay does not put things into the soil, it only takes things out of the soil. You have to fertilize if you are producing a seed hay. But if you've got a legume, the legume is constantly replenishing the soil, and so the quality of soil that that plant is growing out of maintains a fairly constant state of quality. When seeded with grass in a field, a legume will increase the grass yield. So if you have a mix of fescue and timothy and clover or alfalfa, you're going to have a higher yield. Legumes typically are higher in protein because they are growing out of a higher quality soil, and this can be anywhere from 12 to 25%. They also offer a much broader range of amino acids. Legumes have more vitamin A and B than grass or seed hay does as well. There are lots of types of legumes, so alfalfa is the most common one that we will be feeding, and if you are reading the literature from Britain, that tends to be termed lucerne, but we call it alfalfa here. There's other types of clover as well. Peas and beans are also legumes. They're not fed as hay though, and again in North America, not commonly fed at all, more commonly fed in Britain. Alfalfa to look at, typically you're going to be seeing a plant that is much greener than some of the seed hay that we typically have. So alfalfa is high in protein, as we mentioned, 12 to 24%, a broad range of amino acids, very good source of lysine, which again is the first limiting amino acid. So the horse needs to have lysine in order to utilize everything else you're feeding it. Alfalfa is also a good source of calcium, so this is important for balancing the calcium-phosphorus ratio. If your horse has problems with ulcers, Calcium can help to coat the stomach, the upper part of the stomach. So sometimes feeding a few alfalfa cubes to a horse, if your horse has ulcer problems, can help to coat the stomach, especially if you're going to go riding shortly thereafter. Alfalfa does require well-drained soils with a pH of 6.5 to 7, and that is one of the reasons why here in the BC Lower Mainland region we don't typically grow alfalfa. It just doesn't tend to grow well in this area. Alfalfa also does not do well as a pasture because it cannot tolerate heavy grazing or a lot of traffic on it, and it will require a lot of watering in times of drought or summertime. So alfalfa cubes are alfalfa hay that has been chopped and made into a dry cube. So one advantage of feeding cubes is they're non-dusty. So if you've got a horse that has respiratory issues, then very good for that. They're also easy to transport. If you think about, trying to take a bale to a horse show and then transport that bale from your trailer over to the stable area, you're going to leave a big trail of hay behind you. And likewise, when the show's over, transporting what's left back to the trailer, sometimes people just leave what's left of the bale behind, which is a large amount of waste. So if you take a bag of alfalfa cube, then if you're there for a short time, then that might be a way of your horse getting some fiber into its system. However, what you have to be aware of is that your horse does need long stem fiber in its system for its system to work properly. Also, horses that have dental problems can end up with problems chewing alfalfa cubes. So alfalfa cubes for a horse that have dental problems will need to be fed wet. They have roughly the same amount of protein and other nutrients as alfalfa hay, so it's considered a good source of nutrients. Okay, so here we have some questions, and go ahead, try those questions out, and good luck with those. And again, this was Lisa Williamson, and we were looking at Feedstuffs. Okay, thank you. Bye.